Good evening those new to my channel, and return Macabros, and welcome to the latest installment in my One Fatal Flaw series. This series aims to discuss films that I argue suffer tremendously from a single writing and/or directorial decision. That is not to say it is the only flaw in the film, nor do I mean to say said flaw makes the film a complete and utter crapshoot, but rather the particular flaw significantly reduces the quality of the film and/or prevents it from being far more effective and/or thematically brilliant than it already may be. Today we will discuss Milos Forman's 1984 adaptation of Peter Schaffer's stage play, Amadeus. The film tells the story of a fictitious relationship/rivalry between real-life composers Antonio Salieri and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, chronicling Salieri's admiration of Mozart's seemingly God-given talent, an admiration that slowly turns to bitter jealousy, which soon develops into murderous rage. As he sees what he believes is his God laughing in his face, robbing him of the same musical genius that he has bestowed upon Mozart, Salieri begins hatching a scheme to have the last laugh over his God. So, you know how if you ask someone their favorite movie, most people will say something like, I don't know, it's hard to single out one film and call it my absolute favorite? Yeah, I used to be one of those people until I saw Amadeus. Indulge my gushing for just a moment. But personally, I find Amadeus to be not only my favorite film, but a film that I feel comes as close to perfection as is humanly possible. There is an endless list of things I could praise the film for. The absolutely masterful performances by F. Murray Abraham and Tom Hulce, which resulted in an extremely rare double nomination for Best Actor at the Academy Awards, the prize ultimately going to Abraham. The way the film effortlessly switches tone and mood, ranging from slapstick comedy to straight up horror, while never feeling uneven or out of place. The practically unbelievable way the film balances two full-blown character studies simultaneously, how the film doubles as a captivating narrative and a love letter to the genius of Mozart, the deconstruction of religion, and how devotion to one's God can result in both virtuous and evil men, the film sort of playing out like a twisted version of the story of Job from the Hebrew Bible. It's incredible. Seriously, I have seen a lot of action, thriller, and horror films, and yet you may call me crazy when I say one of the most riveting scenes I've ever seen is the climax of the film where Mozart and Salieri compose together. A scene that has so much going on as Mozart begins to reconsider a man he always dismissed as a pretentious nobody, as someone who truly cares for him, making him feel ashamed for all the years he mocked him behind closed doors, all the while not knowing that this very man he is beginning to see in a different light plans to kill him come sunrise. The fact that this film ever got made is a miracle, and the world of cinema is better off because it did. An absolute beauty. And considering all of what I just spoke of, this is what makes this video one of the hardest I have ever had to make. So I am a proponent of what you would call objective film analysis. By that I don't necessarily mean I feel I am the end-all be-all authority on what is or is not a good or bad film, but rather I believe it is important to, especially if you are an aspiring writer or filmmaker, to be able to divorce your own personal feelings from a piece of media and break down the writing and story in a cold, calculating way. And yes, that includes films you may love dearly, no matter how painful it is to do so. Being able to see where a piece of writing falters, even in the smallest of ways, I believe allows you to apply the same critical eye to your own writing, thus allowing you to become a more efficient and effective storyteller. And that brings us to Amadeus. Before I get into today's discussion, let me set the stage for a moment. There are two versions, if you will, of Amadeus. The theatrical cut released in 1984, which runs 160 minutes, and the director's cut, which wasn't officially made available until 2002, which runs 180 minutes. Now, while there are many films that have both a theatrical and director's cut, Amadeus is sort of a special case. Since the director's cut was made available in 2002, it has sort of taken over as the definitive version of the film. When the film was released on Netflix, for example, it was the director's cut. The point I am making is that if you have seen Amadeus within the last 20 years or so, you probably have seen the director's cut, whether you know it or not, with the theatrical cut being quite hard to come by. Now, as I said, the director's cut added in about 20 minutes of footage to the original theatrical release. Now, while most of the ad scenes are not bad per se, they are quite unnecessary, especially if you have seen the theatrical cut and know how the editor worked around them. I would actually recommend, if you have the capability, to watch both versions or at least look into the differences between the two, as doing so is a priceless lesson in the art of writing economy. For example, there is a scene where opera singer Caterina Cavalieri, whom Salieri has the suites for, is performing in one of Mozart's operas. Following the performance, it is announced that Mozart is engaged to a woman named Constanzi. Caterina, upon hearing this, storms off stage. Now in the director's cut, there is an added scene with both Salieri and Mozart speaking with Caterina in her dressing room. She is extremely short and hostile towards Mozart, and by the end of the scene, Salieri realizes that the two of them have had an affair. But in the theatrical cut, the entire scene is cut, and right after Caterina stomps off stage, that is when Salieri puts two and two together and realizes they have had an affair. The same goal is accomplished, and several minutes spent on a redundant scene is saved. One of the best disciplines a writer can perfect is their ability to know where to cut corners, to see where scenes can be removed or handled in a more efficient way. Not only does this make your story tighter, but it also leaves more room for the audience to put two and two together. Many writers have the tendency to over-explain certain plot or character beats as they worry the audience won't pick up on them. But trust me, putting stock in the intelligence of your audience is something they will always thank you for. With that said, I would actually argue that the theatrical cut is superior to the director's cut, as it trims the fat and leaves it to the bare essentials. However, there is one sequence that was added to the director's cut that is absolutely essential to the story, and, due to the fact that it is not in the theatrical cut, actually prevents the theatrical cut from being a potentially perfect film, and that is So in both the theatrical and director's cuts, Emperor Joseph II plans to offer Mozart the honor of becoming his niece Elizabeth's music tutor, but Salieri persuades the emperor to not be so hasty. Due to Salieri's intervention, Mozart is forced to turn over samples of his music to be judged by Salieri and the emperor's other confidants to determine if he is worthy enough to teach royalty. The arrogant Mozart refuses to do so, and he is not given the position. Later on, Constanzi arrives to see Salieri with samples of Mozart's work, which he took from their home. She informs Salieri that Mozart's lavish tastes have left them in quite a bit of financial trouble, and that they desperately need assistance. Stanzi begs Salieri to give Mozart the tutoring position. Okay, so here is where things deviate in a big way between the two cuts. After Salieri sees Mozart's work, astounded by his musical prowess, Stanzi asks him if Mozart will be given the position. So, in the theatrical cut, well, you know what, I'm just going to play the scene because it's sort of, well, see for yourself.
So you will help us?
What? This is awkward as hell. Now, I guess the implication is that after seeing the true genius of Mozart, Salieri just doesn't know what to do, so he dips. But yeah, this is just a bit of a head-scratching moment. And it's an important scene, as it is the moment where Salieri begins to take a more head-on approach to destroying Mozart's career, as opposed to just being passively hindering. Now, Salieri and Stanzi only share one other scene together, and that is at the very end of the film, the morning after Mozart and Salieri spent the night composing together. To give context, Salieri, in his final attempt to defy God, has manipulated Mozart into writing a death mass. Upon completion of the piece, Salieri plans to murder Mozart and claim the mass as his own, performing it at Mozart's funeral, thus having the last laugh over both Mozart and God. However, come sunrise, Stanzi, who had left Mozart earlier in the film, returns home to find Salieri. Now, I'm not going to show the full scene with dialogue, but I urge you to check it out online if you can find it. There is a palpable tension between her and Salieri, most of it not expressed directly through dialogue, but through their body language. You can probably even sense it just by watching the muted footage. Stanzi demands Salieri to leave and takes the death mass he and Mozart had composed together and locks it away, robbing Salieri of his victory even as Mozart passes away moments later. Now, considering the previous scene they shared together, again, this makes their final confrontation a little strange. Like, I can see Stanzi being angry with Salieri, seeing as he just walked out on her, but if you watch this scene, there is so much tension between the two. Like, Stanzi is actually really sweet, so I almost think she would have given him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he just really had to take a shit and didn't know how to make a cordial exit, so he just made his way to the loo. Watching the theatrical cut, it's hard not to find this scene just a little odd, especially considering it is basically the climax of the film. And sure enough, It turns out the director's cut adds in a scene that explains everything. So back to Salieri and Stanzi's first scene together. As I explained, in the theatrical cut, Salieri just awkwardly leaves. But in the director's cut, Salieri makes an advance on Stanzi, telling her to come back tonight, implying he plans to trade the position for sexual favors. This move of his makes sense, seeing as earlier, he discovered that Mozart had had an affair with Caterina. This is Salieri's way of getting back at him, if you will. Despite him later regretting his action and praying she doesn't return, Stanzi returns that night and prepares to take Salieri up on his offer. However, after she exposes herself, Salieri calls in his servant and coldly dismisses her, humiliating her, thus achieving his petty vengeance. And thus, this makes their second and final scene together hold so much more weight. The removal of the earlier scene also robs the context and nuance of Elizabeth Berridge's performance in the final scene. In the theatrical cut, it's hard to gauge her reason for being so upset at Salieri. But in the director's cut, all of a sudden, her performance is shown to have so much more depth. As she speaks to Salieri, we can imagine what is running through her mind. Hatred towards the man who humiliated her, guilt for betraying her husband, despite doing so in desperation. When she locks the mass away, perhaps it is her seeing what her pushing Mozart to take commissions in order to support their family has done to him and wanting to make amends. Also, it makes this following line so much more of an absolute burn.
I regret we have no servants to show you out, Herr Salieri.
And above all else, the added scene makes the finale bitterly ironic, as it was Salieri's own hubris and ego that resulted in him humiliating Stanzi, which is what leads to her distrust of him in the finale, which in turn leads to her locking away the death mass, thus robbing him of even a sliver of the glory and praise he hoped to attain from Mozart. She symbolically locks Mozart's genius away forever out of Salieri's grasp. In the end, despite all Salieri has done, despite how close he was to attaining his goal, it is revealed that Salieri had sealed his own fate so long ago. An absolutely brilliantly ironic ending. So why was this scene, one that I find to be extremely vital to the story, removed alongside a number of other scenes that were removed due to them being a bit redundant? Some have mentioned that the scene makes Salieri way too much of an asshole way too fast, thus making the audience lose sympathy for him. Although I'm a bit skeptical of this, both because, as fascinating as he is, I never really saw Salieri as all that much of a sympathetic character at all, but also because he doesn't go through with it. Sure, he does humiliate Stanzi, but it seemed like he almost didn't expect her to show up at all and was a bit taken aback that she did. It's super shitty, but doesn't necessarily make him into a straight-up villain, at least not more so than he already sort of is. There is a possibility they just thought the scene wasn't necessary and they were fine with the theatrical cut, but given how much it changes Salieri and Stanzi's final conversation, I don't know if I buy that either. However, there is also the chance that they cut the scene because, you know, the original theatrical cut was released with a PG rating, but that got bumped up to a hard R due to the inclusion of the scene of Stanzi exposing herself, which is, like, I get it, but it's so important to the film, and you totally could have shot the scene without showing any nudity and still get the point across. Now you may be asking yourself, well, this scene is in the director's cut, so that would make it perfect, right? Well, unfortunately, it's the addition of the other scenes that absolutely should have been cut that throw the pacing off. Thus, in my opinion, making the director's cut just shy of being a perfect film. I have been tempted at times to re-edit the damn film myself, adding in the scene between Salieri and Stanzi to the theatrical cut, and making what I would consider an absolutely pitch-perfect film. But alas, the definitive version of the film that exists in my dreams is not a reality. Now I am sure some of you watching are perhaps rolling your eyes, as my complaint for this film is by and large the most menial of this series, with the previous episodes discussing flaws that have a far greater effect on their respective films. However, I think that just speaks to how perfect I find Amadeus to be. Even with the more redundant scenes added into the director's cut, the full 3-hour version of the film is still, in my opinion, the closest to perfection the medium has achieved. If you out there have never seen this film or were aware of it but turned off by its length or costume drama-esque appearance, I urge you to do yourself a favor and check it out, as I have a feeling that it will surprise you in more ways than one. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of One Fatal Flaw. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, consider supporting me on Patreon, and I'll see you next time.